strange thing happened in 2009 in Greece. The candidate for the prime ministership, George Papandreou, a socialist head of the PASOK party, was elected, and when he assumed power, he suddenly announced to the world that Greece owed not $80 billion, not $100 billion, not $200 billion, but perhaps $3 or even the equivalent of $400 billion, all expressed in euros, of course. And so almost daily we learned that the national debt was not just 80% of its aggregate GDP, but 100, 120, and the latest figures suggest it may be as high as 160% of GDP. And the ripples of this event went all over the world. Think for a minute. In the United States, until 2009, the Obama administration in particular, and in general, most people on the left had told us that the European Union was a model of social and political stability, a wave of the future, if you will, whether it was mass transit or massive subsidies of wind and solar power or lifetime benefits or the social fabric or high tax, big government. This model, the strength of the euro, the multicultural, multilateral nature of the EU, all of this was the wave of the future, and indeed a paradigm that we should follow in the United States. That vanished almost immediately with these disclosures that Greece had not been candid in the past, but from the very inception of Greek membership in the early 2000s, it had been deceitful and had not told its European Union members that in fact it had exceeded each year the 3% allowable annual deficit. In Greece itself, you would think that there would be some self-introspection, and indeed there were, but more visibly people got very angry. The EU banks, sanctioned banks, the private lenders, and the international organizations had all felt they were the victims of duplicity, and therefore, in order to allow more debt to be taken on by Greece, they had conditions. And you know what the conditions were, that Greece's absurd pension system had to be reformed, the retirement age had to be changed, worker productivity had to be raised, the private sector had to be unleashed, all sorts of government regulations had to be discarded, there had to be budgetary discipline, there had to be an end to high minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here we are with the Greeks and the Northern Europeans fighting back and forth in the age of the EU utopianism. So what were the lessons from it? The EU being an anti-democratic, big government, continental-centric system that was supposed to redistribute income and create a new European man is not working. The United States was told in the proverbial canary in the mine fashion, the United States was told by Greece that this is not a paradigm that you want to embrace, whether it's in California or the United States in general. But there were two other lessons that are sometimes not so commonly appreciated. One is, why did Greece feel so petulant? Why were there strikes and demonstrations, and indeed violence in the street? It's almost as if the nation, at least the Athenian part of the nation, the 5 million people who live in Athens out of 11 million person Greece, it was almost as if they were saying, don't tell us how to spend your money, or lend us more money and we're not going to pay it back. And people were just bewildered, because after all, they did not want to make the necessary reforms from 2009 to 2011. And in fact, they did not make those reforms, and in fact, they couldn't make those reforms, given anemic Greek manufacturing, a backward agricultural sector, the lack of natural resources, endemic tax cheating, and just the absence of natural or man-created wealth in Greece. And so today we look at a situation where each year GDP in Greece declines as its interest and aggregate amount that it must pay back increases. So we're in a series of bailouts. But why do the Greeks seem to be so petulant and lack introspection? In the Greek mind, their membership in Europe was always ambiguous. They were Europe's finger that stuck out into the Eastern Mediterranean, and they were blocked from Northern Europe throughout history by, of course, the Balkans. So in their way of thinking, we're Europeans, but we're exposed. So whether it's the invasion of Xerxes in 480, the largest amphibious assault since the D-Day operation, 480 BC, or whether it was the Ottoman incursions after the fall of Constantinople that destroyed the Byzantine Empire and led to almost 4 centuries of Turkish occupation of the Greek mainland, or whether it was the Cyprus crisis of 1974 or earlier, the Italian and German occupations of Greece. In the Greek mind, we are always invaded. We're a small, proud people. We're at Europe's doorstep. They don't appreciate our frontier position. We're a key partner in NATO, and yet we're always invaded. I can remember walking across the Attic countryside some 20 miles outside of Athens, and in 4 hours I picked up a Roman loom weight, a Byzantine pot handle, and a German 42 helmet, all on one walk, which was emblematic to me of how many people have swept in: Germans, Franks, Italians, Venetians, Romans, Ottomans. Almost everybody in the Mediterranean area and even outside the Mediterranean at one time or another has occupied Greece. And in their way of thinking, they have sort of an insular, paranoid view that we need help from people, but we resent the help because with the help comes dependency, and we're vulnerable to people that are not European, and we're Europe, but we're not Europe, and all of that ambiguity coalesced with this debt crisis. And so we have this strange situation where the Greeks are angry at the people who are supposed to bail them out. Largely that means Germany. Now, a final lesson of the Greek debt crisis was this peculiar role of Germany both culturally and historically. Because after all, they created the European Union system. I don't mean they created it themselves, but their financial clout was the driving force behind it. In the German mind, the idea was that we will renounce military power and crass political bullying, and we will work financially within the system of Europe, and we'll all get wealthy, and we will get status accruing our financial clout. And so for the last 15 years, the system was sort of like a Ponzi scheme. German companies, whether it was Siemens or Mercedes, would lend Greek companies, Greek banks, Greek private firms credits, and they would buy Mercedes. At one point, Athens had per capita more Mercedes than any city in Europe. And Greece then would invest in infrastructure with German capital, know-how, machine tools, expertise. Suddenly, when you went to Greece in 2003, it wasn't like 1973 when I had first gone there 30 years ago. There were new bridges, there were new freeways, there was a new airport, there was a new light rail system, there was a new subway. There was an entirely rebuilt Greece. That was just the public sector. All of a sudden, 5-star hotels started sprouting all over the Aegean coast. So Greeks benefited, and then retirement age went from 67 to 65 to 62, and de facto was 50 or 52 because there were so many exemptions for so-called dangerous occupations that allowed you to retire early. And so it was a wonderful time to be in Greece, as long as the bookkeeping was ahead of the actual reality, and that is that Germany made money by lending Greece credits, Greeks bought German goods, and EU banks covered it all up, or at least the Greeks covered up what they really owed, and the EU banks guaranteed it. So the entire continent was behind this German mercantile system, and then it blew up. And where are we now? Well, we're back to 1936, aren't we? We're in the Greek newspapers. We read of German Gauleiters, the Fourth Reich. There was a headline not long ago in a Greek evening paper that said, Dachau, Angela Merkel is portrayed in Greek newspapers with a Nazi uniform as if she's in the SS. By the same token, if you look at German newspapers, it's all the stereotypes of lazy, siesta, double commuting Greeks laying on the beach, while Germans are getting up at 5 in the morning to pay for those retirement systems. In other words, there's sort of a German problem, isn't there? How did Europe historically deal with German industriousness? Because what we're left with is a country of about 82 million people who is producing more goods and services in aggregate than are 130 million Mediterranean, Portuguese, Spanish, Italians, and Greeks who owe them well over $2 trillion. How did that happen? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to Tacitus, or Caesar's account of the Roman experience with Germany. Germany, you see, was beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire went from Scotland to the Sahara and to the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Euphrates, but it never went north or east of the Rhine and Danube rivers. And in their way of thinking, Germany was too tribal, too fierce, too cold. Whatever the particular exegesis was, the Romans thought that they just couldn't conquer it. And in the German mind, there was the notion that we are wild, we are freer, and they came up with a word in early German called Volk. Volk doesn't mean German alone, in a sense of people who speak German, like Americans. Americans are characterized by an idea, by a constitution, by the English language. In Germany, Volk means the way you look. So if I were to go to Germany, being Scandinavian, I might be able to pass as part of the Volk. If someone was African American or Chinese, they would never be fully accepted as German. That was partly because they were never fully assimilated in the Roman Empire. If we were to read German philosophers, whether it's Nietzsche or Hegel or Oswald Spengler, there was a notion that Germany is different. It's more dynamic. And once you had the confederation of German provinces, whether it was Pomerania or Bavaria or Saxony, at the end of the 1860s, for the first time there was a notion that the Volk were united. And that meant that a very, very determined, politically cohesive, culturally uniform, and industrious people, for the first time, were one nation. And almost immediately Europe was unable to handle that. And what happened? We had the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71, where Germany simply absorbed large portions of French Alsace-Lorraine. And after that settlement, we went to war again in 1914, where the Germans wanted not just the Alsace-Lorraine, but a great deal of France itself, as well as an overseas empire in North Africa. And we had a terrible 8 million person lost World War I. And then we had the Versailles Treaty, and the Versailles Treaty was supposed to stop German nationalism and dynamism. People said it was too tough on Germany. Well, in retrospect, it wasn't tough enough, because although it did cut off parts of the German-speaking empire by allotting territory to Czechoslovakia and Poland, the international city of Danzig, for example, was a good example of that. And although it did force reparations upon Germany, the Germans inflated their economy. They did to Europe, France, Britain, American creditors what Greece is doing to it today. And they got a sense of petulance, anger about this treaty that was very harsh in theory, but in fact not harsh enough. It was not nearly as harsh as what the Germans forced the defeated Russians in 1917 to submit to. It was not nearly as harsh as what the Kaiser had envisioned the peace terms for Britain. And so we did not have peace after Versailles. We had yet another war with Germany, and this time, with the defeat of Germany, the Allies said never again. They occupied Germany. They cut it in two, actually cut it in four, but it ended up a communist East Germany, a free West Germany, and we thought we'd solve the German problem. 12 million Germans were forced to free East Prussia. The word Prussia disappeared from the world's lexicon. And if that was not going to be enough, and the occupation of Germany and the democratization of Germany to bring it in to the world of Western nations, they had other crazy ideas too at the time. They would divide Germany, as I said. They would have the common enemy of Soviet Russia. They would create the NATO alliance. Remember the NATO alliance? Keep America in, Russia out, Germany down. And if that weren't enough, then the Germans would start to be a member of the European Common Market, which morphed into the EU. Why was all this necessary? Because Europeans feared German dynamism, which for over 100 years always translated native industriousness and a particular culture into military influence and political power. And we thought we had solved the problem. Britain was going to be nuclear, France was going to be nuclear, Germany could not be nuclear. And here we are today with what? Germany is united, the EU is imploding, there is no Soviet common enemy, and all we have left is NATO, and the United States is pulling its troops out. And once again, Germans are feeling what? They're feeling that we work harder, we produce more, and people are trying to find ways to put us down. And the Greeks are making fun of us while they had their hand out for more German money. And what's the result of all this? There really is a German problem, and it transcends all the politically correct notions of European Union and NATO and the new 21st century where war will not be there and a UN-guided war. In other words, we're back to the 19th century in some ways, and it's going to be a very interesting next 50 years.